The news. Many of those 50 years he spent right here at CBS. He later moved to CNN and now is heard on national public radio. Over the years, SCHORR has been responsible for many national scoops, but throughout his career, he has also been a magnet for controversy.
Have you discussed with Mr. Mikoyan whether the Soviet Union can sell to Cuba the jet planes that Cuba needs?
This is a secret.
Is this a secret?
Sir.
The report is 338 pages of unrelieved criticism of activities all the way from spy submarines lurking off the Soviet coast to secret procurement of armored limousines for a foreign dictator and women for the visiting King Hussein of Jordan. Now, perhaps for the first time, the 20 people designated as White House enemies in September 1971. 16th, Congressman Ronald Dellums of California, who was black. 17th, Daniel SCHORR of the Columbia Broadcasting System in Washington. The note here is a real media enemy.
Why is it that Dan SCHORR, more than almost any other reporter I know, and certainly more than any other reporter in television, constantly, over a period of decades, has gotten into flaps?
At times I felt like an Al Capp character like Joe Bifflestook, who's sort of going his own way, and every time he looks around, some house has fallen down or there's been a hurricane or something, and he looks around and wonders how it's happened and why it keeps happening over his shoulder.
With us now, Dan SCHORR. Welcome.
Glad to be back.
Is this the first time you've been in this building?
First time I've been in this building in 10 years since I left CBS.
How does it feel?
It feels wonderful, especially because there are a lot of old friends here and some new friends here, and a sense of all the turmoil of 10 years ago have faded, and there's nothing left but very good memories.
Do you still not have a good answer, or do you now have an answer to Mike Wallace's question? Why has there been so much controversy about the reporting and the style of Dan SCHORR?
Well, it's maybe a less flip answer, but essentially the same answer. It is, I always found it necessary to tell people what some people in authority didn't want them to know. And that tends to get some people upset. President Nixon called me some bad names not because I was going after him, but because I was disclosing things about what was going on in his administration that he would rather not have known. And because I specialize, because I feel it's almost a mission, to find out for people what others don't want to tell them for one reason or another, I get to be an unfavorite person of some people.
Have you mellowed now in your 50th year from, say, 15 years ago when you were 12 years ago in the midst of the Watergate time?
I think so. I found myself generalizing more and investigating less. I find myself now much more able to see the motivations of others and to understand that different people under different pressures act in certain ways, and I'm much less inclined easily to condemn.
Why? What happened?
I got older, found out that no one's perfect, found out that I'm not perfect, found out that people all do what they have to do, and that's why I find that even with CBS, when we had a great standoff back 10 years ago, and I now better understand why CBS did what it had to do in the interest of this great institution.
The right decision.
A decision that had to be made. Each one had to make a decision. And people make decisions not because they're bad, but because they're serving different interests and seeing them with different perspectives.
Who would you want to apologize to at this time, not just at CBS, if anyone, in terms of any of the controversy, because you understand things differently now?
Apologize to? I haven't thought in terms of apologies. I'll tell you, the whole episode of 10 years ago has so faded, and I guess it is part of the
release of the Pike
selective,
report.
The release of the Pike report and everything I followed. You know, I sort of spilled out my guts and tried to write it down in a book, and in the book more or less apologized for the way I did it, the misunderstandings that were created in the way I did it. Not that I did it, but the manner in which I chose to do it. And now it all kind of blurs together, and I'm not sure whether after 10 years one shouldn't say, instead of apologies, that there ought to be a statute of limitations on feuds and let's go on.
Is it possible, do you think?
It's possible for me. I'm not mad at anybody, and I would hope a lot of people are not mad at me anymore.
When you look at the career, what are you most proud of? What's the achievement that you think reflects the best of what Dan Schorr has tried to do in journalism?
Well, the thing I've tried most to do in journalism, and can't be called a single episode or a sensation, has been try to add an element, to add a dimension to information. I believe that what is called just the facts, ma'am kind of information doesn't serve the public today, because just the facts, ma'am, are facts that are dished out by people for different reasons. And that one has to add that one element to it which will make people understand why it happens, who is doing what he or she is doing. So it's been a career devoted to adding an extra dimension. Now, there are some things which stand out in my mind more than others in terms of single things because they were dramatic in themselves. I mean, for example, CBS and I together were proud of the fact that in 1957, we, for the first time ever in history, put a Soviet leader on television. When we put Nikita Khrushchev on Face the Nation, putting him on television for the first time in America and for the first time in the Soviet Union. You know, it was a great thing to happen. I think that it stands out in my mind that I was permitted to be the principal correspondent covering the Watergate scandal, and that we did pretty well. Not as well, perhaps, as some newspapers, but better than anybody else in television.
In the beginning, you wanted to stay away from that story because you said it was a newspaper story.
In the beginning, I wanted to stay away from purely personal grounds. Believe it or not, I'm 70 now. I thought I was too old then for that kind of story. I thought it was a story for young, eager people like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And I thought, secondly, that it was a story very hard to do for television because it involved endless investigation in libraries and looking up facts. And television tends to be impatient with using its people for things where they're not going to be seen for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And so I suggested that it really was the kind of a job which was better suited to a person they could more easily spare on a day-to-day basis. Furthermore, I will be frank to admit that while I thought there was a lot more there than met the eye, I also thought that the Nixon administration had the ability to maintain a cover-up, that the full story would never come out. I simply underestimated President Nixon's capacity for self-destruction.
And then when he resigned, I think the thing that seemed to draw the ire more of CBS than anything, with perhaps the exception of the Pike Report, was the lecture at Duke University in which you said what? Because there's some misunderstanding, and it resulted in a letter being written by Cronkite and Rather and Severide to New York Magazine. What did you say about that, and what was the core of that problem? The
core of the problem was that on the night of Nixon's resignation, when he delivered his resignation speech in August 1974, that I was very unhappy about this way CBS had covered it. CBS had led in exposing Watergate, I said, as regards television. But on that night, CBS seemed to draw back. And some of my colleagues would make remarks that I thought was rather strange. I'm not going to mention names. I really decided that in order not to revive feuds, I'm not going to talk about.
No, I'm not trying to get you to do that, but these are issues, if we look at 50 years of journalism, that are singular parts of
yeah, and as an issue to be remembered, I will remember it. I thought that CBS as a whole went soft that night, and had some reason to suspect that it didn't go soft accidentally, but that CBS higher executives had been afraid that Nixon, in resigning, would polarize this country with a big denunciation of television, CBS in particular.
The interpretation,
and I expressed my unhappiness about that at Duke.
And the interpretation was that management had leaned on correspondence, and they had succumbed to that, which they vehemently denied.
Right. And I thought that there was an atmosphere being created, things being said, don't be vindictive, and so on. That suggestions were being put out that we should go easy on President Nixon at that time, and since Watergate had been a story I'd been devoted to, I thought that was really not the way to handle it.
You would not change anything about that speech, that lecture that you made at Duke University?
What I might change is that I might not have delivered it in public. I would have written it as a letter to some of my bosses. I mean, I think that it was probably unwise under the influence of a bull session with a lot of students to come out and say it in a place where it could get out in public. I have learned that there are ways in which you can express your opinions inside an organization without going outside the organization to do it. If you ask me what I regretted that an issue was created between me and my colleagues when I thought the issue was between me and higher management.
Dan Schorr, back in a moment, celebrating 50 years in journalism.
Lived on the ground floor of an apartment building, and heard a big plop outside and looked out, and there was a man lying dead who had jumped off the roof. The first thing I did was to wait for the police to arrive, listen to them, and call a local newspaper and say, I got a story for you.
That began your life as a stringer.
That began my life as a stringer. It has always somehow been a part of my life that the immediate impact of what has happened is less important to me than making sure that all the facts about it are collected and presented right. And it was weird, because you'd think that at the age of 12 I would have been horrified or something. I don't remember that.
You went to what?
Went to DeWitt Clinton High School.
Where you editor of the paper?
Where I was an editor of the paper. I went to City College, where I was an editor of the paper. I was high school stringer, college stringer for one paper or another. Then I tried to get a job with the New York Times at a time when they didn't have a job. Went to Europe, wrote for them anyway, even though I wasn't on their staff. Almost got a job with them until finally one day, 1953, happened to be after a severe flood had hit Holland, and I'd been stringing for CBS and covering that. And thanks to Ed Murrow, got a cable which said, I remember the words of the cable in 1953, which said, would you at all consider joining the staff of CBS News with an initial assignment in Washington?
What'd you think?
Well, first I thought I thought that broadcasting wasn't really very serious business for a journalist to be in, and it wasn't really like a newspaper, but let me give it a try.
Well, did you have any sense of awe for Murrow then?
Yes, I had a sense of awe for Murrow, but I thought that Murrow was a singular, and remains today even, but remained a singular person in CBS, and that for the average person in CBS, remember in 1953, it was a time when it was mainly radio. Television hadn't quite entered the picture yet. And having lived in Europe a long time, I had a rather look-down-my-nose attitude about radio as giving little capsules of news, but not being a serious place for news.
Then you went to Moscow, 1955.
Washington, right. Came to Washington in 53 and covered the State Department and assignments here and there abroad. 55 was sent to open the CBS bureau in Moscow, and left there at the end of 57, having spent 2 years, 3 months, 14 days, and 18 minutes in the Soviet Union, and was more or less invited by the Russians not to return.
What was the wasn't there a deal where you, who was the Russian leader who, some question, and he said some question about you not being able to come back? Was that Bulganin? Who was
No, in the early days, I had gone there on a one-week visa.
Yeah.
With orders from CBS to open a bureau, but my visa was good for a week. At the end of the week, it had expired. It wasn't renewed. They didn't tell me to stay. They didn't tell me to go. And so I went up to Prime Minister Bulganin at a reception and said, listen, can you extend my visa? Because here I am, my visa having expired. I really am in violation of your law. And he took my chin in his hand and he said, well, a criminal, a real criminal face, said Bulganin.
And
Russian humor.
We have here a clip of you, which is 1960, vintage Dan Shore with Castro and Mikoyan. Here it is.
Have you discussed with Mr. Mikoyan whether the Soviet Union can sell to Cuba the jet planes that Cuba needs?
This is a secret.
Is this a secret?
Sir.
Excuse me. Then I will turn.
Answer about that.
Fine, thank you, sir. May I turn then to Mr. Mikoyan and ask, what would you say is the principal result of your visit to Cuba?
Главных результатах вашего визита в Кубу.
Я считаю, что доктор Фидель Кастро сказал так хорошо, что мне не стоит иначе сказать, как он сказал.
I think that Dr. Fidel Castro said so well that I don't need to repeat it.
There you are in 1960. You had obviously come to enjoy broadcasting, but now at the end of 50 years, do you wish you'd stayed in print?
I am quite ambivalent about that. I really want to have, I wish I had 3 feet and I had 1 foot in print and 1 foot in radio and 1 foot in television.
You have always, though, taken the opportunity to write op-ed pieces.
That's
and
right.
to write for magazines. You've never given that up.
That's right. My 50 years really encompassed the growth of all the media. When I started, newspapers were it, and radio was small and television hardly existed. Those 50 years marked the evolution to a point where most people today get their news from television. But as I look back, I'm doing more radio now than television at National Public Radio and having a great time doing it. And when I sit down at a typewriter and write a piece now and then for the op-ed page of a newspaper, I then say, but this is the only way to impart information. So that I'm quite mixed up about it, but quite content to be mixed up in that way, because if we have all these ways of presenting information, I like doing it every which way.
What would you like the epitaph on a reporting career to say if that ended tomorrow, if you sailed off into the sunset with your family?
I don't know. The epitaph would be, try to tell you what you didn't know, because he thought you ought to know it.
Dan Schorr, back in West Germany, suggesting, would you take back that report and tell us what it was about?
I would take back about one sentence of the report, which was one bad sentence. The report, 1964, I was stationed in Germany on the eve of the Republican Convention in San Francisco. I was asked to provide a report on what was happening in Germany connected with the upcoming American election. And I did a report, which I thought worth doing, about the fact that right-wing people in West Germany, including neo-Nazis, were very excited about the prospect of a right-wing person, Goldwater, being nominated for the president. And they made a great deal about that. There was a story to be done. Furthermore, I learned that Senator Goldwater was planning immediately after the convention to come to Germany and spend a vacation there with a friend of his who was a commander of one of the armies in Germany, but to spend it at Berchtesgaden, which was an American army rest place, but had been the favorite place of Hitler, which I thought, in terms of perception in American politics, was very strange. All of that I tried to put together into a story. And I thought the story was just a fairly routine story to do. I had a sentence in it which, on reflection, and I had a lot of time to reflect about it, was badly put. I wanted to write about the way the German right-wing people are all excited about Goldwater. So I spoke of a polarization between Goldwater and the German right wing, suggesting that Goldwater was a part of that polarization, which I did not know to be true and may not have been true, and did say that was a really stupid sentence to put in. I apologize. The rest, however, was simply on the whole factual, trying to present the point that somebody is not very good at public relations if they send Goldwater to Germany as a nominee for president to make his first couple of weeks there. That then became part of a larger mess, which I hadn't known about until it came to my attention, which had to do with the fact that Goldwater already had something against William S. Paley, the head of CBS, because he was known to be close to former President Eisenhower and who might therefore be supporting Scranton against Goldwater. So it all became part of a larger picture into which my story entered.
But the bottom line was at CBS, Fred Friendly had to sign off whenever you did a political piece.
Yes, there was a lot of trouble. As a matter of fact, when I interviewed Mr. Paley for my book, when I left CBS, I decided to interview Mr. Paley for it. He was very good about it, sat down and talked to me for many, many hours over 2 days. When I said to him, you know, what do you have against me? He said, I've had something against you since 1964. And it was then I found out that the problems were not over Watergate and not over anything else, but as far as he was concerned, he'd had something against me ever since the Goldwater episode because he'd been embarrassed by it, and I'd never known that.
Let me take a look, finally, at one more tape. We saw this in the beginning. You have not seen this tape except here. This is you finding out you were on the enemies list, where you had offended the Nixon administration. Take a look at this tape.
16th, Congressman Ronald Dellums of California, who was black. 17th, Daniel Schorr of the Columbia Broadcasting System in Washington. The note here is a real media enemy. Number 18, S. Harrison Dogol of Philadelphia, president of Globe Security Systems. 19th, Paul Newman, the movie actor from California. And number 20, Mary McGrory, the columnist of the Washington Star.
The ordinary thing about that is it was live, is that right?
Yes.
And you were looking at the list, and you had no idea that number 17 was...
Hadn't read it before. As usual, I wanted CBS to be first.
Yeah.
The list had just been handed out, and all three networks were live covering these hearings gavel to gavel. And so I rushed up to the camera. George Herman, Nelson Benton were here in this very studio, anchoring from here. And I had, quick, let me take the air. I got the list. I got this first enemies list. So got on the air maybe seconds, who knows, before the others. And here's a list. I haven't read it, but here it is. And proceeded to go down this list of names. And, you know, and as I came to my own name at number 17, you know, the impulse was I wanted to faint or say wow or something like that. And of course, at a time like that is the severest test that you will know that professionalism ever faces, is when you suddenly find yourself dragged into the thing you're covering unexpectedly, and what are you going to do about it? And the only thing you can do about it is to try to go on to the next name as though it's just another name. Then, of course, I've called and said, listen, when the story is done for the evening news, have somebody else do it. I can't possibly do this story.
If you were giving a last lecture about journalism today, what would you want to say to those people who followed Dan Shor for a long time?
I would say, it's a lecture I've given, but I'm going to give it short this time. I would say there are a lot of people out there with the talent now, increasing talent and ability and resources to manipulate you and get their story on and the way they want their story told. That you stand there as the public's gateway. And when you let them through, make sure that when they get through and get their little cause promoted, their stories told, their thing advertised, their candidacy pushed, make sure that you always add something so people will really know what it's all about. Don't rush for the quick sensation. Don't follow the ambulance, the police car. Don't stick your microphone into the face of people who've been hurt. Remember them and their privacy. Remember that it's not just a matter of being one step ahead of the other station, the other network, but that first of all, the public is there, and secondly, the people that you've got to deal with are very real people.
Dan Shor, 50 years in journalism. Night Watch continues.